She didn't wake up to flowers. She didn't wake up to tears of relief, or her husband's grateful hands holding hers, or the sound of her babies crying in the next room. She woke up to white. A ceiling, a monitor,
I'm okay, Dad.
49 days of silence she hadn't chosen, and a husband sitting beside her bed, calm,
Nora,
composed,
the results are back.
flowers in hand,
It's not what we
telling her
hoped
that
for.
one of their triplets hadn't survived. He
I
described
can't
the
pretend
funeral,
anymore.
the
This is
memorial
breaking
garden,
me.
the tiny
know.
fingers that
I'm
had
here.
curled
We'll
around
face
his
this
thumb.
together.
He cried at exactly the right moments. He said all the right things, and something inside her, something that had survived 49 days of nothing, something that no coma could touch, quietly, certainly whispered, "That's not right." She had no evidence. She had no proof. She had just woken up from the longest absence of her life with a broken body and a foggy mind and 3 seconds of silence that didn't add up. But she had something stronger than evidence. She was a mother, and somewhere in this city, her son was alive. What happens when the person who is supposed to love you most becomes the greatest threat to your children? And what does it take, from a hospital bed with a body still learning how to breathe, to fight back? Stay with Nora, because this story doesn't end in a hospital room. It ends with tulips pushing through frozen ground and a mother who never stopped. Lesson statement before we begin. This story is a reminder that your instincts are not weakness. That quiet certainty in your chest, the one that says something is wrong, even when you have no proof, that is not paranoia. That is the part of you that has always been paying attention. Trust it. If this story moves you, if Nora's fight feels familiar, or important, or like something someone you love needs to hear, take 5 seconds right now. Hit like. Leave a comment telling us what moment stayed with you. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that they are stronger than they think. And if you're new here, subscribe, because every week we bring you stories like this one, stories about real human courage, told the way it deserves to be told. We'll see you in the next one.
The heart monitor beeped, low, steady, indifferent to everything. And then a breath came, ragged, searching. A breath that had no business existing after 49 days of silence, but existed anyway, because some things simply refuse to stop. The first thing Nora Callahan saw was white. Not the soft white of a nursery she had spent 4 months painting, not the warm cream of the hospital walls she had toured during her 3rd trimester. Running her hand along the surface and imagining what it would feel like to bring 3 babies home. This was the white of fluorescent lights, of bleached sheets, of a world that had been stripped of every color she had ever loved. She blinked. Once. Twice. Her eyelids felt like sandpaper dragged across glass. She's waking up. A woman's voice, crisp, professional, moving quickly. "Get Dr. Strauff. Now." Nora tried to speak. Nothing came out. She tried to move her hand. It responded, but slowly. Like a signal traveling through wet concrete. Like her body had forgotten the instructions and was reading them again for the first time. Where am I? Where are my babies? Those were her first 2 thoughts. Not what happened to me. Not how long have I been here. Just, where were her children? Because the last thing she remembered was a pain behind her eyes, so sharp it had split the world directly in 2. She had been sitting in the hospital cafeteria, 38 weeks pregnant with triplets, eating a bowl of oatmeal she didn't want because her obstetrician had told her to maintain her iron levels. She had been reading a text from Dell about baby shower centerpieces. Something about whether blue and yellow together looked too much like a sports team. And then the pain had arrived, white and absolute. And then nothing for how long. Dr. Pamela Strauss entered the room before Nora could spiral any further. She was a compact woman in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back neatly, and eyes that held the practiced calm of someone who had stood beside many impossible moments and not been shattered by any of them. "Nora." Dr. Strauss's voice was warm but measured. She moved to the bedside with the economy of someone who had done this before. Welcome back. Take your time. You're safe, safe. The word landed strangely. Why would she say safe, unless safe was not the default assumption? Nora's lips finally cooperated. Her voice came out like gravel, scraping against old pavement. My babies, she said. Dr. Strauss did not look away. She held Nora's gaze with deliberate steadiness. That was the first sign. When a doctor holds your gaze that carefully, it means they have rehearsed what comes next. Your husband is on his way, she said. He's been here every day. My babies, Nora said again, more forceful this time. Her body might be broken and slow and confused, but the instinct living in her chest was fully, furiously awake. Dr. Strauss sat on the edge of the chair beside the bed. She folded her hands. She breathed. You delivered your triplets 7 weeks ago, she said. You experienced a severe postpartum hemorrhage complicated by a cerebral event. What we call a stroke-adjacent episode. You've been in a medically induced coma, Nora. You've been unconscious for 49 days. 49 days. 49 days. Nora stared at the ceiling. The white, expressionless ceiling that told her nothing and held everything. 7 weeks. Her children had been born. They had taken their first breaths. They had cried their first cries. They had opened their eyes for the very first time and looked at a world that contained their mother. Except their mother had been in this room, in this bed, absent from the very first chapter of their lives. Miles, she whispered. Ivy. Owen. She had named them before they existed outside of her body. She had whispered those names to her belly every single night for 4 months. Miles, Ivy, Owen. 3 heartbeats on the ultrasound screen. 3 tiny bodies she had felt moving and fighting and insisting on existing against every medical odd stacked against them. Dr. Strauss was very quiet. Miles and Ivy are healthy, she said. They're home. They're doing beautifully. Nora caught it. The pause that followed. The slight recalibration in the doctor's breathing. The way her hands, folded in her lap, pressed together just a fraction more firmly. And Owen, Nora said. Another pause. A fraction too long. Your husband will be here in 30 minutes, Dr. Strauss said. He'll want to be the one to... Tell me. Nora's voice had gone completely flat, controlled in a way she did not recognize as her own voice. It sounded like someone's mother. It sounded like someone who had learned, in the space of 60 seconds, that the world required a different kind of attention than she had previously given it. Tell me right now? Dr. Strauss looked at her hands. Garrett reported that Owen did not survive beyond the first week, she said. The words were careful, each one placed with precision. He passed, according to the records, 14 days after birth. Neonatal complications. You were still unconscious at the time. The ceiling was very white. Nora lay completely still for a long time. And somewhere in the back of her mind, not grief, not yet, not the lurching wrongness she expected, something quieter arrived instead, something that lived in the place where instinct kept its most important work. That's not right. She did not know why she thought it. She had no evidence. She had nothing but a feeling that had no name and no logic and no foundation in anything she could articulate. She had just woken up from 49 days of nothing, and her brain was rewiring itself in real time, and she should not be trusted to interpret anything accurately. But the thought was there, small and certain and completely unmovable. That's not right. She filed it. She said nothing. She looked at the ceiling, and she breathed. Garrett arrived at 11:47 in the morning. She had been watching the clock on the wall, 41 minutes since Dr. Strauss had left her. 41 minutes of trying to arrange herself, trying to locate the grief, waiting for the sobbing to arrive the way it was supposed to. It didn't come. That frightened her more than anything else that morning. He walked in, carrying flowers, pale pink tulips. She recognized them as her favorites, without being entirely certain she had ever told him that. Had she? Or had he simply chosen pink because pink was what you brought to a maternity ward, and he had not thought any further than that? He looked tired. Genuinely, honestly, tired. Shadows under his eyes. Roughness along his jaw. He saw her looking at him, and his face crumpled in a way that looked very much like relief, and he crossed the room in 3 strides and took her hand, and his hands were warm. Nora. His voice broke on her name. Oh, thank God. Thank God. She let him hold her hand. She watched his face. I've been so scared, he said. He said it with the rhythm of something practiced, something said many times in the last 7 weeks. Perhaps to her unconscious face, perhaps to other people, perhaps to himself in the dark. Owen, the doctor told me, she said. His face shifted, just slightly, something she would not have noticed before the coma, something that lasted less than a full second and was replaced immediately by an expression of grief that was entirely appropriate and entirely readable. But she had seen the thing beneath it, the fractional recalibration, the almost invisible adjustment. I'm so sorry, he said. I'm so sorry I couldn't. Was I there, she said. Not a question. A request for information. He blinked. What? When he died, Nora said. Was I in the room, or was I still unconscious? Still unconscious, Garrett said. He passed in the NICU. I was with him. Were you alone? She said. Another blink. Fractionally slower than the first. Your mother came for a few hours, he said. And mine. Nora nodded slowly. She looked at the tulips sitting on the windowsill. Outside the glass, she could see a strip of gray October sky. 7 weeks. The leaves would have turned and fallen while she slept. An entire season had moved through the world without her. I want to see the death certificate, she said. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. She counted each one. Garrett's expression did not change. His voice did not change. He said, Of course, I'll bring everything you need. He said it the way someone says something they have prepared themselves to say. The way someone says something that is true enough to be useful. Thank you, she said. She looked at the window. She said nothing else. And in the place where the grief was supposed to be living, the small, certain thought sat quietly and waited. That's not right. Garrett said all the right things. That was the problem. He said, Of course, anything you need. He said, I have all the paperwork. I'll bring it tomorrow. He said, I want you to have closure, Nora. I want you to be able to grieve properly. He cried. Real tears, or what appeared to be real tears, when he described sitting beside Owen's incubator in the NICU through the long nights. He described the baby's face, the shape of his nose, the way his tiny fingers had curled around Garrett's thumb. He described the funeral. A small graveside service. Just family. Just close friends. He said he had chosen a memorial garden at Calvary because it was peaceful and beautiful, and he thought Nora would approve. I couldn't wait, he said. His voice broke in the right place. I'm so sorry, Nora. The doctors didn't know when you'd wake up. I didn't know if you ever would. I had to do right by him. Nora listened. She nodded in the right places. She let him hold her hand, and she did not pull away from the warmth of it. And she cataloged everything he said, every word, every pause, every place where the emotional timing was slightly off, in a way that she could not name but could absolutely feel. like a piece of music played correctly but without feeling, all the notes in the right order. Something essential missing, because something was wrong with the grief. She knew what grief felt like. She had lost her father at 17 years old, and she knew the specific anatomy of it, the lurching wrongness of a world with a piece removed, the way ordinary moments became landmines. She had been waiting for that feeling since the moment Dr. Strauss said the words, waiting for Owen's absence to press its specific shape against her chest. It didn't come. Instead, what came was something adjacent to grief, something that kept circling back to the 3-second silence, something that noticed Garrett had said he and the baby and him repeatedly for 2 hours, without once saying the name she had chosen before any of them existed. Owen. 4 letters, 1 syllable. The name she had whispered to her belly every night. He had not said it once. God, I'm being paranoid, she told herself. I just woke up from a coma. My brain is not working correctly. He has been here for 49 days without me, carrying 3 newborns and my possible death and his own grief. He is exhausted. Grief makes people strange and distant and imprecise, but, she said, tell me about Miles and Ivy. And something genuinely warm moved through Garrett's face then. Undeniable, immediate. He spent the next 15 minutes showing her photographs on his phone. Miles with his father's chin and a tuft of dark hair that stood up slightly at the crown as though perpetually surprised. Ivy, with her mother's wide forehead and a way of regarding the camera as though she had already decided whether she trusted the person holding it and the verdict was still pending. They were beautiful. They were hers. Looking at them knocked the breath from her body in a way that the grief for Owen had not, and the guilt of that comparison nearly buried her. Dell wants to come, Garrett said, tucking his phone away. I told her to wait until you were stronger. Nora looked at him directly. You told Dell not to come. To wait, he said. It's different. She's my best friend. She's also... He paused. Something moved across his face and was quickly managed. She's a lot, Nora. I just wanted to give you time to process before... Call her, Nora said. Today. Garrett nodded. He smiled in the way of someone who has decided that an argument is not worth having right now. Of course, Bob said. He left at 2 in the afternoon. The door closed. Nora stared at the ceiling. He never said Owen's name. Not once. 2 hours. Not once. She checked her phone when the nurse came in and helped her hold it. She went to her contacts. She called Dell herself. Delphine Marsh picked up on the second ring. Oh my God, Dell said. Oh my God, Nora. Hi, Nora said. I have been sitting by my phone for 7 weeks, Dell said. 7 weeks. I have checked it approximately 400 times per day. Garrett kept telling me to wait, that you needed rest, that visitors would be too much. I know, Nora said. Come today. Come now. A pause. I'm already in the car, Dell said. Dell came that afternoon. Delphine Marsh had been Nora's closest friend since the second week of their first year of college, when they had both reached for the last copy of the same textbook in the campus bookstore and solved the problem by photocopying alternate chapters and splitting the cost. In 22 years, Dell had seen Nora through her father's death, 2 relationships that ended badly, the infertility diagnosis that had made triplets via IVF feel like a miracle that the universe owed her personally, and every unremarkable Tuesday in between. She walked into the hospital room and looked at Nora, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Dell sat down in the chair beside the bed and took Nora's hand and said, You scared the absolute hell out of me. I know, Nora said. I'm sorry. Don't apologize, Dell said. How are you actually? Not how you're telling the nurses. Not how you're telling Garrett. How are you actually? Nora looked at the door. Closed. Garrett was gone. Something's wrong, she said quietly. She said it the way you say something that has been growing in the dark for 49 days and has finally found enough light to exist in words. I don't know what, but something is wrong about Owen. Dell went very still. The particular stillness of someone who has been waiting for a specific sentence. What do you mean? She said. I mean, I don't feel the grief the way I should, Nora said. I mean, Garrett's story is right. The details are all there. But it feels like... She stopped, chose the words carefully. It feels like something that was written down and then memorized. Does that make me insane? Dell was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than comfortable. Then she said, No. Dell, I've been watching him for 7 weeks, Dell said. Her voice was low and careful. I know you always tell me I'm too suspicious of him. I know you think I see problems where there aren't any. But there was something, Nora. Something I could not identify. I kept telling myself I was projecting. I kept telling myself grief makes people behave strangely and he was doing his best. She stopped. Tell me specifically what made you suspicious. He never said Owen's name, Nora said. Not once. In 2 hours. He said he and the baby. Never Owen. Dell stared at her. The silence between them had a particular quality. The quality of two people recognizing the same thing simultaneously. I need to see the NICU records, Nora said. I need to see Owen's death certificate. Garrett said he'd bring the paperwork, but I want to see it before he chooses what to bring me. I need to know what the hospital actually has on file. I'll find it, Dell said. And I need you to call the hospital where I delivered, Nora said. I need to know about neonatal death protocols. If a baby dies in their NICU, who witnesses it? Who documents it? Is there more than one signature required? Is the mother always notified in writing, even if she can't receive it directly? Dell looked at her for a long moment. Her face had gone the particular color it turned when she was working very hard to hold herself together. Yeah, she said. I'll find out everything. That evening, Dr. Strauss returned for Nora's end-of-day assessment. Nora asked, as casually as she could manage, about neonatal death documentation. Dr. Strauss's eyes were careful in the way of someone who had been thinking about a question before it was asked. Standard protocol requires documentation of next-of-kin notification, she said. Even when a parent is incapacitated, a formal record is made. A copy should have been placed in your maternity records as a linked patient file. Can you find it? Nora said. Dr. Strauss looked at her for a moment that held more weight than its length suggested. She looked at Nora the way doctors look at patients who are asking the right questions for reasons that have not yet been named. I'll look into it tonight, she said. Nora thanked her. She lay in the dark after the lights were lowered. She listened to the monitor beside her bed. She did not sleep for a very long time. She made a list inside her head, the way she had always made lists when she needed to organize something too large and shapeless to hold all at once, things that don't fit. 1. He never said Owen's name. 2. He told Dell to wait, not to protect Nora, to control what Dell could observe and report. 3. The 3-second silence when she asked for the death certificate. 4. Her mother, apparently, had come to the NICU. Her mother, who Nora knew, had been in Baltimore caring for Nora's aunt when the babies were born. A 6-hour drive. She had come for a few hours and gone back. Possible, but worth confirming. 5. She stopped at 5. 5 required, saying something out loud that she was not yet ready to say, not until she had more than instinct in a count of silences. He never said Owen's name. She returned to it the way you return to a bruise, testing it, finding it real. Outside her window, the October sky had gone entirely dark. The next morning, Dr. Strauch came back without the records she had promised to find. She came back instead with a specific quality of stillness. The stillness of someone who has found something and needs to decide how to present it. Nora had not slept well. The unfamiliar recalibration of a body learning to be conscious again had kept her near the surface all night, and the list behind her eyes had kept her from sinking beneath it. She had spent the dark hours adding to the list and discarding nothing. Dr. Strauch closed the door quietly behind her. She sat in the chair beside the bed. She did not open the folder she was carrying immediately. "I pulled your linked maternity file last night," she said, "and the NICU admission records for all 3 Callahan infants." Nora waited. She had learned in 49 days of enforced absence that waiting was its own form of strength. "Miles and Ivy were admitted to our standard NICU care facility on September 2nd, Dr. Strauch said. Owen was admitted alongside them at the same time. She looked at the folder in her hands. Then she looked at Nora directly. "Nora, Owen Callahan was discharged from this hospital on September 16th. The room was completely quiet. "Discharged," Nora said. "He was released into the custody of his father, Garrett Callahan, at 4:17 in the afternoon," Dr. Strauch said. "At that point, he was rated medically stable. He was underweight but within normal range for a triplet birth at 38 weeks gestation." "Discharged," Nora said again. Not a question, just the word, placed carefully in the air between them, because repetition was the only way she could make it real enough to stand on. "According to our records," Dr. Strauch said, very quietly, "Owen Callahan was alive and healthy as of September 16th. He was released to his father." She paused. "There is no death certificate filed with this hospital, Nora. None. We have no record of Owen's death." Nora pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. He was alive. Owen had been alive. He had been discharged from this hospital, rated stable, medically sound, within the normal weight range for a triplet birth. He had been placed in Garrett's arms in good health on September 16th. And then Garrett had come to her bedside 7 weeks later and described a graveside service at Calvary Memorial Garden and the shape of a baby's fingers curling around his thumb. He lied. The thought arrived without drama or crescendo. Just flat, enormous, unmovable fact. Garrett lied. "Owen is alive somewhere, and I have been in this bed for 7 weeks without knowing my son exists in the world." She stared at the ceiling. She breathed through her nose. She counted 4 breaths. She did not let the thing breaking open inside her chest come out yet, because once it came out, it would take a long time to get back under control, and she needed to be in control for what came next. "Who took him?" she said. Her voice sounded like someone else's, flat and functional and operating at some remove from the wreckage. "Where did Garrett take him?" "That's beyond what our records can tell us," Dr. Strauch said. "But Nora?" She stopped. Then carefully, deliberately, "You need an attorney, today, and you need to be very careful about what you say to Garrett until you have legal counsel in place." "Does he know you pulled these records?" Nora said. "No." "Don't tell him," Nora said. "I won't," Dr. Strauch said. The memories came then, not all at once, in waves. The way the ocean moves when it has decided to take back the shore. She had not been able to access them clearly until now. The fog of waking up, the overwhelm of the first 24 hours, the effort of managing her face during Garrett's visit, all of it had kept the memories at a distance. But now, they arrived with sudden, devastating clarity. Garrett, 3 weeks before the delivery, standing in the nursery with a tape measure, she had walked in and found him measuring the space between the wall and the window, and she had laughed and teased him for being obsessive. He had smiled and said he was just checking that the third crib fit. She had kissed his cheek and gone back to the kitchen, checking that the third crib fit. She turned the memory over now like an object in her hands. Was he checking that it fit? Or was he measuring something else entirely? Some calculation she had not been invited into. Garrett, 2 months before the delivery. On the phone in the backyard, late on a Sunday evening, she had come to bring him iced tea, and he had seen her through the sliding glass door and ended the call before she opened it. She had assumed work. She had always assumed work, because assuming work was easier than the alternative. Garrett, the day of the ultrasound that confirmed triplets. She had been crying from shock and joy, overwhelmed, 3 heartbeats, 3 small lives. She had looked at his face, expecting the same overflow of feeling, and found something quieter there. Something that was processing rather than celebrating. He had said, 3. Just that word, 3. Not with wonder, not with the particular astonishment of hearing something extraordinary, with the specific flatness of a man encountering a number that required recalculation. She had not heard it then. She had been too full of her own emotion to hear anything in his. She heard it now. "I need an attorney today," Nora said. "And I need you to not document any of this in my medical file yet. Just give me 24 hours. Dr. Strauss looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded. Dell arrived an hour later. Nora told her everything in a single steady breath, because she had learned already that stopping meant feeling it. And feeling it meant losing the function she needed right now. Dell sat completely still through the entire thing. Her hands were flat on her thighs. Her face was working hard at composure and mostly succeeding. When Nora finished, Dell said, "Cecile Harmon." "Who?" "Family law attorney. She handles custody. She's the best in the county, and she will absolutely lose her mind when she hears this in the most professional and useful way possible." Dell was already typing on her phone. "And Ray Dexter, private investigator, friend of my brother's. He's good, Nora. He's quiet and thorough and good." "Yes," Nora said. "Both. Today." "Done," Dell said. She looked up from her phone. "Garrett doesn't know you know?" "No," Nora said. "That's the only advantage you have right now," Dell said. "I know," Nora said. "I'm going to use it." Dell looked at her with an expression Nora recognized. The expression she wore when Nora surprised her. The expression that said she was seeing something in her friend that she had not fully seen before. "When did you get this calm?" Dell said. Nora looked at the window. The October sky outside was the color of old pewter. Somewhere in this city, in some building she did not yet know the address of. Her son was 4 months old. "I've had 49 days of practice," she said, being completely out of control. Garrett arrived at visiting hours the next afternoon carrying Miles. He stood in the doorway of her hospital room, holding the baby against his chest with the practiced confidence of a man who had been a single father for 7 weeks, and he watched Nora's face as she saw her son for the first time. Miles. Dark hair that stood up at the crown, her husband's jawline already emerging in miniature, round cheeks that suggested a person who had discovered eating and found it unambiguously worthwhile. He blinked at the unfamiliar room with the particular gravity of someone determining whether this new environment merited his attention or his concern. Nora held out her arms. They trembled slightly. The nurse standing near the door moved toward her. Careful with the IV, Mrs. Callahan. And then Miles was in her arms, and she pressed her nose into his warm hair and breathed him in. Baby shampoo, warm skin. The weight of him, solid and present and undeniable. She held him for a long time, long enough for the shaking in her arms to stop, long enough for the part of her that had been running calculations and cataloging silences to step back for a moment and simply be his mother. Garrett sat in the chair near the window. He watched her with an expression she recognized as tenderness, mixed with something else, something she had once interpreted as awe and now understood as relief of a different kind. The relief of a man whose story is still holding. "Where's Ivy?" Nora asked. "With your mother," he said. "She didn't want to overwhelm you with both at once." "I want them both tomorrow," Nora said. "Both of them, together." "Of course," he said. She looked down at Miles. She smoothed his dark hair. She did the thing she had always done when she needed to think without showing it. She made her face very soft, and her attention very deep, and she let Garrett read it as pure maternal absorption. "Tell me about the funeral," she said. She felt him shift in the chair. "What do you want to know?" he said. "Where is Owen buried?" she said. The question was simple, specific, answerable in one sentence. There was nowhere to hide inside it. The pause before his response was 3 seconds. The same 3 seconds as before. She was beginning to understand the architecture of his pauses. "There's a memorial garden," he said, "at Calvary. It's a beautiful spot. Quiet. I'll take you when you're strong enough." "A memorial garden," she repeated. "Not a grave. For infants," he said. "Sometimes the family chooses a shared memorial space rather than an individual plot. I thought it was kinder, more peaceful than—" "Did you take photographs?" she said. "Of the service." A pause, slightly different from the others. The pause of someone running options. "I couldn't," he said. His voice went rough in the right place. I wasn't in a state to think about documentation. I'm sorry, Nora. I just couldn't." Of course, because there was no service. Because there was no grave. Because Owen was not in a memorial garden at Calvary. Owen was somewhere else entirely. Alive. 4 months old. In a building she didn't have the address to yet. She pressed her lips against Miles's forehead and felt the warmth of him against her mouth. "I understand," she said. She said it the way you say something when understanding is not what you feel, but functioning is what you need. That evening, after Garrett had gone, Dell came back with Ray Dexter's first report. She kept her voice low. The door was closed. Miles had gone back with his father. "Ray looked into the financials," Dell said. "Nora, there's a second account. Garrett opened it 14 months ago." Nora went still. 14 months ago," she said. "Before the IVF transfer that produced the triplets," Dell said. "Before the babies existed. He opened a secondary account and large transfers started going in 2 months before the birth. They stopped completely on September 16th. September 16th, the day Owen was discharged from the hospital into his father's arms. He paid someone," Nora said. "Ray believes so," Dell said. "He's still tracing where the money went, but there's also—" She stopped, looked at her hands briefly. "Ray found an apartment, leased under Garrett's name, started 8 months ago." Nora looked at her. "There's someone else," Dell said. The words were quiet and precise. "A woman, younger. She has been living in that apartment since before the babies were born." The room was very still. "He planned this," Nora said. She said it slowly, the way you say something that is too large to say quickly. "He was already building a different life before I was even pregnant. He was already somewhere else, and he let me go through the IVF and the pregnancy, and—" She stopped. When the treatment produced 3 children instead of 1, she said, something changed in the plan. 3 was too many for what he was building. 3 was too visible, too expensive, too complicated. 2 was manageable. 2 was explainable. Dell said nothing. She let Nora find the shape of it herself. He gave Owen to her, Nora said. He took my son from the hospital, and he gave him to the woman in that apartment, and he told me Owen was dead. The silence that followed was the kind that had actual weight. I'm going to find him, Nora said. She said it the way she had said things in her head in the dark, flat and absolute. A fact that had not yet happened, but was already determined. I am going to find my son. I know, Dell said, and I'm going to help you. That night, after the lights were lowered and the hospital settled into its nighttime hum, Nora asked the nurse to leave the television off. She lay in the dark for a long time. She thought about Owen's hands. She had never seen them. She had been unconscious when all 3 of her children came into the world. She had no memory of the delivery room, no memory of the first cry, the first wait, the first specific smell of any of them. She had missed the beginning entirely and was trying to find her way into a story already several chapters in. Miles smelled like baby shampoo and warm skin. She knew that now. Owen was 4 months old somewhere in this city. He was real. He had a smell and a weight and a way of looking at the world that was entirely his own. He had been alive for 4 months, and she had not been present for a single moment of it. And the person who was supposed to love her had looked her in the eye and described a funeral that never happened. She breathed, but slowly. In, out. He is alive. That was the whole sentence. That was the only sentence that had any importance right now. Her son was alive. She turned carefully onto her side. The IV shifted with her. Outside the window, a few stubborn stars had pushed through the cloud cover. I am going to find him, she thought, and I am going to bring him home. Cecile Harmon arrived at the hospital on Thursday morning and sat in the chair beside Nora's bed and set her briefcase on her knees and looked at Nora for a moment before saying anything at all. She was a tall woman with reading glasses on a chain and the particular stillness of someone who had spent many years listening to people in the worst moments of their lives without being consumed by any of it. She had the kind of composed face that made you want to tell her the truth without preamble or decoration. Before we start, Cecile said, I want you to know that everything you're feeling is allowed. Rage and grief and love for your children and terror about what comes next. All of those things can live in the same body at the same time. You don't need to be coherent. You just need to be honest with me. Owen is alive, Nora said. I need to know where he is. I know, Cecile said. Here's where we stand as of this morning. She opened the briefcase and removed a folder. The emergency discovery motion had been filed the previous afternoon. Because Owen had been discharged from the hospital without a corresponding death certificate, and because no adoption filing had appeared in the state's standard registration system within the legal window, Cecile had also contacted the state's Department of Children and Family Services. A welfare check had been initiated at the apartment. She has been found, Cecile said. Nora went rigid. The woman in the apartment, Cecile said carefully, her name is Wren Ashby. She is 29 years old. She and Garrett have been in a relationship for approximately 14 months, which aligns exactly with when the secondary financial account was opened. And Owen, Nora said. Cecile's pause was different from Garrett's pauses. It held information rather than concealment. The welfare check found an infant in that apartment, she said. A boy. 4 months old. He is in good health. He is being cared for. Another pause. One beat. Rin Ashby did not know the child had been removed from his mother without her knowledge or consent. According to her initial statement to the caseworker, Garrett told her Owen was the result of their relationship. He told her that she was his mother. The room held the silence, the way rooms hold things when what has been said is too large to immediately absorb. He told the other woman she was Owen's mother, not that he was placing a child in her care, not that he had removed a baby from a hospital. He had handed Rin Ashby a 4-month-old infant and told her she was his mother. Given her a role in a fiction so complete and so detailed that she had had no reason to question any of it. Rin didn't know, Nora said. We believe not, Cecile said. Her reaction to the caseworker's questions was consistent with genuine shock. Nora looked at the window. The October sky outside was the flat gray of a day that had decided not to commit to anything. She thought she was a mother, Nora realized. This young woman has been caring for my son for 4 months, believing he was hers. She has fed him and held him and watched him learn to exist in the world, and she has done all of it, believing she was his mother. Something complicated moved through Nora's chest. It was not sympathy, exactly. She was not in a position for sympathy, not yet. But it was not hatred either. What happens now? She asked. A dependency hearing has been scheduled for Monday, Cecile said. Owen will be placed in emergency protective custody pending the hearing. We will be filing simultaneously for immediate return to your custody. He'll be in foster care over the weekend, Nora said. Her voice fractured very slightly on the last word. Briefly, Cecile said, I'm sorry. I know, but it protects the integrity of your custody claim. If we move outside the legal process, Garrett's attorney will find a way to use it. I know, Nora said, I know. She pressed her hands flat against the bedsheet. She breathed. He is alive, and he is safe, and it is going to be a few more days. A few more days she would not get back. A few more days of his life she would not be in. But he would be fed and warm and cared for. And then the law would do what the law was designed to do, and she would bring him home. I'm not crazy, she thought. She said it clearly in the space behind her eyes, said it the way she said things to herself in the dark. I know what I saw. I know what I felt the moment I woke up. Every instinct I had from the first minute was right, and I am never going to apologize for trusting it. That afternoon, Garrett came to visiting hours. He brought Ivy this time. Nora's daughter regarded her from within the safety of her father's arms with the wide, appraising gaze of a person who was taking in a great deal of information and had not yet decided what to do with it. When Nora held out her hands, Ivy allowed the transfer with a dignified composure that made Nora's heart crack open with love. She held her daughter and breathed her in and made her face entirely soft and her eyes entirely present. Garrett talked about the babies, about how Miles had started smiling, about how Ivy had a vocal range that suggested she had opinions about everything and was developing the means to express them. He talked about the pediatrician appointments and the sleep schedule and the specific brand of formula that worked best after the first 3 weeks. He talked about all of it with the fluency of a man who had been building a competence narrative for 7 weeks. A story in which he was the capable, devoted, single-handed father of 2 surviving children and a grieving widower of 1. She let him tell it. She watched his face, and she cataloged the places where the story required maintenance, the slight over-explanation of certain details, the way he looked at his hands when he mentioned Owen peripherally, and then looked back up with precisely calibrated sorrow. She smiled when he said something warm about the babies. She touched his hand once and said, "Thank you for taking care of them." He looked at her with something that might have been guilt or might have been relief. The two expressions lived very close to each other on his face, and she was not yet fluent enough in the language of his deception to distinguish them reliably. He left at 6 o'clock. The door closed. Nora held Ivy for another 20 minutes before the nurse came to take her back. She pressed her lips against her daughter's forehead and said very quietly, just for the two of them, "I found your brother. I'm going to bring him home." Ivy blinked at her with the ancient patience of someone who has heard a promise and is prepared to wait for it. The hearing was at 9 in the morning. Nora was not yet discharged from the hospital, which meant she attended by video. Her laptop propped on the hospital tray table, a cardigan over her hospital gown, because she was not going to face this proceeding in institutional cotton if she could help it. Dell sat just outside the camera frame, close enough that Nora could feel her presence like a warm wall. Garrett had not been informed about the hearing until the summons reached their home address on Friday afternoon. He had called Nora's hospital room 3 times on Saturday. She had not answered any of them. He had left 3 voicemails that moved through concern, then confusion, then something with the shape of concern but the temperature of a different thing entirely. She had listened to all 3. She had sent them to Cecile. Now, on the laptop screen, she could see the courtroom. Cecile at the plaintiff's table. Garrett in a navy suit she recognized from his client presentations, the suit he wore when he needed to appear dependable and in command. His attorney beside him was a man who looked like he had received a great deal of information in a short period of time and was managing it imperfectly. On the other side of the aisle, Wren Ashby sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the floor. She looked young in the way of someone who has received catastrophic news and is still absorbing the shape of it. She wore no makeup. Her stillness was the stillness of a person running on the other side of something enormous. She looked, Nora thought, like a woman whose grief was still finding its form. The judge was a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses and the particular expression of someone who had heard a great many things in this room and could not always be surprised, but could always be interested. She called the hearing to order. Cecile presented the facts with the economy of someone who understood that the facts, in this case, required no embellishment. Owen Callahan had been discharged from NYCU care on September 16th to his father. No death certificate had been filed with any hospital or municipal office. No adoption proceeding had been initiated through legal channels in the state. The child had been found in the care of Wren Ashby, who had been told by Garrett Callahan that the child was the biological result of their relationship. It's about a statement directly contradicted by the hospital's genetic records, which listed both Nora and Garrett as documented genetic donors in the IVF process that had produced all 3 children. Garrett had obtained a temporary guardianship filing, completed quietly enough to avoid triggering standard cross-referencing protocols, using documentation that Cecile described carefully as requiring further forensic examination. When Cecile stopped speaking, the courtroom was very quiet. Garrett's attorney said that his client had acted in the best interest of the child given the mother's extended incapacitation and the extreme circumstances of the family situation. The judge looked at Garrett for a long moment. Then she looked at the screen where Nora's face was composed and still and absolutely present. "Ms. Callahan," the judge said, "I want to acknowledge the circumstances under which you are participating in this proceeding. This court recognizes your situation fully." She ordered Owen placed in emergency protective custody pending a full evidentiary hearing the following week. She issued a no-contact order restricting Garrett from relocating Miles or Ivy from their registered addresses. She ordered a forensic accounting of the secondary financial account. On the screen, Garrett's jaw had gone completely still. The expression on his face was the expression of a man watching an architecture collapse, watching the careful structure of the last 7 weeks begin to come apart at points he had not anticipated. He had counted on her grief. He had counted on her recovery. He had counted on the fog of waking up after 49 days and the weight of loss and the manageable story he had built so carefully. He had not counted on 3 seconds of silence being enough. After the hearing, Dell closed the laptop. They sat in the hospital room without speaking for a moment. Ray found more, Dell said eventually. Her voice was quiet and precise. The transfers from the secondary account. He traced where they went. Nora looked at her. There's an unlicensed adoption facilitator, Dell said. Operating privately. Garrett contacted them 8 months ago, Nora, before the babies were born, before Owen had a name. The silence that followed had actual weight. He was planning this before Owen existed, Nora said. Before any of them existed in the world outside of you, Dell said. He was making arrangements for the removal of one child before the IVF transfer had even succeeded. When the treatment produced 3 instead of 1, 3 was too many, Nora said. 3 didn't fit what he was building with Wren. So he decided on 2, and he removed the 3rd. Dell nodded. He didn't choose Owen because of Owen specifically, Nora said. The realization arrived with nauseating clarity. He chose a number, he decided he wanted 2, and one of them became the wrong number, and that one became Owen. Her voice stayed even through all of it. She was aware, distantly, of how remarkable that was, how the very thing Garrett had counted on, her overwhelm, her grief, her recovering body, had instead produced something he had not planned for. Something that happens in women sometimes, in the extremity of loss. A particular, focused, unshakable anger that has no need to perform itself. She did not rage. She did not cry. She built. What time is the evidentiary hearing? Monday, she said. That evening, Nora called Dell, from the hospital phone. I keep thinking, she said, what if I had just believed him? About the memorial garden, about the service, about all of it. She stopped, breathed. I would have spent the rest of my life grieving a child who was alive, who was 15 minutes from where I was lying. I would have visited an empty stone in a memorial garden while Owen was learning to hold his head up without me. But you didn't believe him, Dell said. I almost did, Nora said. My first instinct was to feel insane for doubting him. To tell myself I was traumatized and confused and projecting. That's what he counted on, Dell said. The coma, the grief, the medical recovery. He thought you would be too overwhelmed to question anything. A long pause. I'm not crazy, Nora said, flat and certain. The statement of someone who has decided something permanently. I know what I saw. I know what I felt from the moment I opened my eyes. Every single instinct I had was right. Yes, Dell said. I deserved better than this, Nora said. My children deserved better than this. Yes, Dell said again in exactly the same tone. The tone of someone who knows that the only right response to a fact is to confirm it. The week between the preliminary hearing and the evidentiary hearing was the longest of Nora's life. She noted the comparison with full awareness of what it was being measured against. She had spent 49 days unconscious. She had spent 4 months of pregnancy after years of infertility, counting every day with a particular attention. She had lived through the death of her father at 17 in the specific, formless grief of a teenager who does not yet know how to carry something that heavy. This week was still the longest. Owen was in a foster placement. The social worker emailed Cecile twice daily with updates. A couple in their 40s, no children of their own. He was eating well. sleeping in stretches, healthy. On Wednesday, at 3 in the morning, the social worker sent an update that said Owen had started smiling. He had started smiling. Nora read the update on her phone in the dark of Dell's guest room. She had been discharged from the hospital on Tuesday, and Cecile had strongly advised against returning to the marital house while the proceedings were active. Dell had set up the guest room with the focused, practical competence of someone who had been waiting to be useful for weeks. Yellow quilt, window overlooking a small garden. Diapers and formula, stacked in the kitchen in quantities that suggested Dell had surveyed the situation and decided to leave nothing to chance. Nora lay in the dark and held her phone against her chest. Her son's first smile had happened in a foster home with people who were kind but who were strangers. His first month of life, his first weeks in a place he believed was his home, his first weeks with the woman who believed she was his mother, all of it had happened while Nora was somewhere else. Absent, unable, and now he had smiled for the first time in the care of people who were doing their best, and she had found out via a 2-sentence email. She did what she always did when the grief became too large to hold as a single thing. She made it small. She folded it down into the smallest possible shape. She placed it somewhere she could manage. He is alive, she said to herself in the dark. He is safe and warm and fed. He smiled today. He is alive. That was the whole sentence. It was enough to breathe through. In the morning, she opened her laptop and began to write. She wrote down everything she could remember about the last year of her marriage. Every moment that had seemed unremarkable at the time, and now, reread from where she stood, held a different quality. She wrote for 3 hours straight. Dell brought coffee at some point and set it on the table without disturbing her and left quietly. Garrett's attorney had sent a letter suggesting that Garrett's actions, while procedurally irregular, were motivated by genuine concern for 3 children during their mother's incapacitation. The letter used the phrase procedurally irregular to describe the fabrication of a child's death. She read it 3 times. Then she kept writing. She wrote about the word 3 said at the ultrasound. She wrote about the phone call in the backyard. She wrote about the tape measure in the nursery. She wrote about every occasion in 4 months of pregnancy when he had spoken about Miles and Ivy by name and referred to the 3rd child with a slight, consistent remove that she had attributed to superstition or overwhelm or the simple difficulty of fully imagining 3. She wrote, she had known, not fully, not consciously, but something in her had known all along. And she had chosen not to know it, because knowing it was incompatible with the life she was trying to build. She wrote, I'm not doing that anymore. She wrote, somewhere along the way, I became someone who trusted his version of things more than her own. I became invisible to myself. Starting over feels impossible, but staying invisible feels worse. She stopped, read it back. Then she added, the hardest part is admitting I knew. The bravest part will be making sure it never happens again. She closed the laptop and went to make fresh coffee and stood in Dell's small kitchen looking out at the garden and breathed until she felt functional again. Then she went back and kept building her case. On Friday evening, 3 days before the evidentiary hearing, Garrett texted, I know you're angry. I need you to understand why I did what I did. I was trying to protect our family. She looked at the message he hoped for a long time. Protect our family. He had fabricated the death of one of their children and told his affair partner the baby was hers. He had opened a secret account and hired an unlicensed facilitator before any of their children existed outside of her body. He had spent 7 weeks visiting her unconscious face in the hospital and deciding every single day to say nothing. And the story he was telling himself the story he apparently believed sufficiently to put in a text message, was that he had been protecting something. She forwarded the message to Cecile. Then she sat in Dell's guest room, in the dark, and held the knowledge of all of it, and felt the full weight of the worst part of this particular betrayal. Not that he had lied to her, not that he had planned it in advance, not even that Owen had spent 4 months in someone else's arms believing that someone was his mother. The worst part was this: she had loved him. She had built a life with him. She had gone through years of infertility and the physical and emotional cost of IVF with him beside her, and she had believed they were building something together. She had believed his presence in the delivery room meant something. His presence at every appointment meant something. His hand on her belly means something. And he had been running calculations the whole time. She sat in the dark with it. She did not push it away. She let it be exactly as heavy as it was. Then she picked up her phone and texted Cecile. "I'm ready for Monday. Tell me everything I need to know." On Sunday morning, Cecile called to say that Wren Ashby had contacted the office. Wren wanted to speak to Nora. Nora sat with the request for the rest of Sunday. She thought about the woman she had seen on the video screen, the folded hands, the eyes on the floor, this quality of her stillness, which Nora had recognized as the stillness of someone who had been entirely restructured by information received too fast. On Sunday evening, she said yes. They met Monday morning, before the hearing, in a coffee shop 3 blocks from Cecile's office. Dell came and sat one table over, present but not intrusive, a warm wall at a useful distance. Wren Ashby was younger looking in person than on screen. She was sitting at the table when Nora arrived, both hands wrapped around a coffee cup, the way people hold something when they need an anchor. She looked up when Nora walked in and held the eye contact with the deliberateness of someone who has decided that the very least she can do is not look away. They sat across from each other for a moment without speaking. Then Wren said, "I'm sorry. I know that isn't enough. I don't know what is. I just needed to say it first." "You thought he was your son?" Nora said. "Yes." The word was simple and immediate. Garrett told me he had a previous relationship, before me, a woman who hadn't wanted to keep the baby. He said Owen was his, and the mother had given up her rights, and he needed someone who would love him. She stopped. Her voice was very steady in the way of someone who has cried themselves to a different kind of stillness. "I believed him. I had no reason not to. I loved him from the first day. I love him." She corrected herself. "Owen. I love Owen." "What is he like?" Nora asked. The question surprised Wren. Her eyes went bright. "He's determined," she said. "He knows what he wants, and he has opinions about it. He doesn't just cry, he announces himself, like he's making a statement and he's waiting for a response." She paused. "He smiles with his whole face, not just his mouth. His whole face gets involved, his cheeks, his eyes, everything." Nora's chest ached in a way that was not simple. "What are you going to tell the court?" she asked. "Everything," Wren said, without hesitation. "Every conversation, every text and email. I kept records. I didn't know why I kept them. I just did. I want to help you get him back." She looked at the table for a moment. "I know I'm part of how he was taken from you. Even if it wasn't my intention, I'm part of it. And I want to help fix that." "You were lied to," Nora said. "As completely as I was. The person responsible for this is one person, and neither of us is him." Wren looked up. "Can I ask?" she said, very carefully. "After everything is settled, can I ask sometimes how he's doing? I know I have no right to anything. I just... Nora looked at this young woman who had spent 4 months loving her son, who had held him in the NICU and brought him home and watched his first smile, and had done all of it in the genuine belief that she was his mother. She is also a victim, Nora thought. She lost a child this week too. Not the same way, but she lost him. I'll think about it, Nora said. It was the most honest thing she could offer, and she meant it. The evidentiary hearing lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. Rin's testimony took 45 minutes. It was delivered with complete precision and without deflection. She produced 14 months of messages in which Garrett had built, piece by piece and detail by detail, a parallel life that bore no relationship to the one he was actually living. She read certain messages aloud in a voice that stayed level only because she had clearly decided it was going to. The forensic accountant testified for just over an hour. The secondary account had received and disbursed $42,000 over 11 months. The largest portion had gone to the unlicensed adoption facilitator, not as a direct payment for a child, but as what the facilitator had described in his own emails as a consulting fee for private newborn placement. Dr. Strauff testified about the discharge records, about what the NICU documentation showed. Ray Dexter submitted his 40-page report. When Garrett's attorney stood to speak, he said that his client had made choices under extraordinary pressure that he now recognized were not in the best interests of his family. Not in the best interests of his family, as if he had perhaps chosen the wrong school district or made an ill-timed investment. The judge looked at Garrett for the last time that session with an expression Nora recognized. The expression of a woman who has heard exactly as much as she needed to. She ordered Owen returned to Nora's custody, effective immediately upon the conclusion of proceedings. She ordered Garrett's parental rights placed under formal review. She referred the case to the district attorney for evaluation of possible criminal charges. She said, Mrs. Callahan's parental rights were violated in one of the most fundamental ways this court has encountered. I want that statement on the record. It was on the record. Nora, watching on the video screen from the coffee shop's back booth, pressed her hand flat against the table and breathed once, slowly and completely. The truth win, she thought. Everyone sees now. Everyone. Owen was brought to Cecile's office at 2:30 in the afternoon. The social worker carried him in a car seat. He was wearing a blue onesie and a soft hat that was slightly too large, the brim falling forward over his forehead. He was doing what Nora was beginning to understand was his signature behavior, looking around at the new environment with the focused attention of a person who takes information gathering seriously. Nora sat in the chair across from the door. She had been sitting in that chair for 11 minutes. She knew because she had watched the clock on Cecile's wall with the specific attention of someone who has learned that the only way through a long wait is to be fully present in each second of it. When the social worker set the car seat on the floor in front of her, Owen looked up. He looked at her the way 4-month-olds look at everything, with complete, undiscriminating openness. No history, no expectation, just a new face in his field of vision, being assessed with the tools available to him. And then, because babies do what babies do without apology or explanation, he smiled. His whole face, his cheeks, his eyes, every available surface of his expression involved involved in the project. Exactly as Rin had described. Exactly. Nora picked him up. Her arms were stronger than they had been 2 weeks ago. Physical therapy had attended to that with a thoroughness she was now grateful for. He was warm. He was solid in the way of a person who has been reliably fed and reliably held. He smelled different from Miles. A slightly different note beneath the same baby shampoo. Some particular quality, that was entirely his own, and she held him against her chest and pressed her face into his hat and breathed him in. "Hi," she said quietly, just for him, just the two of them in the whole room. "Hi, Owen. I'm your mom. I'm so sorry it took me this long." Dell stood in the corner with her hand pressed over her mouth. Cecile was very busy with something on her notepad for several minutes. Nora held her son for a long time before she said anything else to anyone. She held him with the focused completeness of someone who has been waiting for an extremely specific thing and is now in the presence of it and intends to be fully there. He made a sound against her shoulder, not a cry, an announcement, exactly as described. "I have arrived. I have opinions. I am ready to proceed." "Me too," she said. That night, all three babies were in Dell's apartment. Dell had organized the guest room with the military precision of someone who had been planning this for a week. 3 borrowed bassinets, arranged in a careful triangle. A rocking chair moved from Dell's own room. Diapers in organized stacks, formula and bottles lined in the kitchen in precise order. Nora sat in the rocking chair at 11:45 at night. Owen was in her arms. Miles and Ivy were visible in their bassinets from where she sat, all three of them sleeping with the absolute conviction of people who have been given to understand that the world is safe and warm and they have someone to come back to. The room smelled like baby shampoo and the faint lavender of Dell's fabric softener. The heat was on low. Outside the window, a street lamp cast a pale orange light across the garden that Dell had not yet put to bed for winter. Nora sat in the rocking chair and did not sleep and did not try to. She thought about the year, the IVF, the pregnancy, the careful weeks of preparation, the moment in the cafeteria when the pain arrived and everything went white, and then the 49 days of nothing, and the white ceiling, and the 3-second silence, and the 41 minutes of counting on the clock while she waited for confirmation of the things she already knew. And now this room, this smell, 3 sleeping faces. Starting over doesn't mean starting from nothing, she thought. It means starting from everything you learned on the way here. She looked at Owen's sleeping face. His hat had slid back. His forehead was her forehead. She could see it clearly now, in this light. The same broad space between the eyes that she had always thought made her look thoughtful, and that Owen apparently intended to deploy for maximum effect as he developed opinions about the world. "I was right to trust myself," she said quietly to the dark, to the 3 sleeping faces, to herself, to whoever needed to hear it. "From the very first moment I woke up, I was right, and I am never going to apologize for knowing something was wrong." She rocked slowly. The chair made a soft rhythm against the floor. Outside, the street lamp held its steady orange light. On Thursday morning, Cecile called. Nora was feeding Ivy in Dell's kitchen. Miles was in a bouncer near the table. Owen was asleep in the guest room with the focused purposefulness of someone who had decided this was his scheduled rest period and was committed to it. "Garrett was arrested this morning," Cecile said. Nora set down the bottle. She looked out Dell's kitchen window at the small garden. 2 counts of custodial interference," Cecile said. 1 count of filing fraudulent documentation with a court. 1 count of conspiracy with an unlicensed adoption facilitator. The district attorney's office moved quickly. Nora was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "I'll be in touch," Cecile said. Nora put the phone down on the table. She picked the bottle back up. She looked at Ivy, who was regarding her with the patient attention of someone who has been interrupted and is prepared to give it a moment but does have things to attend to. "Your dad is going to have to answer for what he did," Nora said to her daughter, "to the people whose job it is to make sure that happens." Ivy was unimpressed by this information. She returned her attention to the bottle. Fair, Nora said. The truth win, she thought. Complete. 3 months later, Nora was living in the marital house. Not because she couldn't have moved. Cecile had presented her with several options. She could have sold, she could have rented somewhere new, she could have started entirely fresh in a place that held none of the weight of the last 3 years. She had considered each option with the careful attention she was bringing to every decision now. The attention of a woman who has learned what happens when you stop paying it. And she had looked at the nursery, the 3 cribs, the specific shade of yellow on the walls that had taken 4 attempts to get right. She had decided she was not going to let Garrett take one more thing from the inventory of her life. She had moved the 3rd crib back into line with the other 2. She had taken the framed photograph of Garrett from the bedroom dresser and placed it in a box in the garage. Not destroyed, not burned, just removed from the daily visual landscape of her life. There had been a version of herself, somewhere in the weeks after the hearing, that had wanted to destroy it. She found she didn't need to. The photograph was simply evidence of a period of her life that was now over, and it could live in the garage with the other things that were finished. She had gone back to work part-time. Technical writing for a healthcare software company, which she could do from home, which she did at the kitchen table, with a baby monitor system that Cecile called NASA level, and Dell simply called correct. She worked in the mornings, when the babies slept their longest stretches. And in the afternoons, she did the physical work of being their mother with the focused presence of someone who has learned what absence costs. She had also, 6 weeks after bringing Owen home, called a therapist. Dr. Sylvia Crane had an office with a small fountain on the windowsill and a policy of beginning each session with 2 minutes of complete silence. Nora had initially resisted this. She was not a person who found silence restful. She was a person who filled silence with lists and assessments and the productive arrangements of information. By the 4th session, she had come to regard those 2 minutes as the most useful portion of her week. She had told Dr. Crane, in their 5th session, about the ceiling, about how much time she had spent in the early days staring at the hospital ceiling and letting it hold the weight of things she could not carry herself, about how the ceiling had felt, in those days, like the only reliable surface in the world. "What does a ceiling feel like to you now?" Dr. Crane asked. Nora thought about it. "Like a ceiling," she said. "That's progress, Doctor," Crane said, in the simple tone of someone identifying a fact. Garrett's criminal proceedings moved through the system with the slow certainty of something that has been set in motion and cannot be reversed. Cecile updated her weekly. His attorney was negotiating. The adoption facilitator had agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for considerations that were not Nora's concern. Ruth Callahan had called once, Garrett's mother. A stilted, difficult phone call that lasted 11 minutes and ended with Ruth saying, "I didn't know about any of it. I want you to know that." "I believe you," Nora said. Ruth cried. Nora found she had no rage left for a 62-year-old woman standing in the rubble of her son's choices. The rage was a finite resource, and she had spent it where it needed to go. Carol Briggs, Nora's mother, had arrived with 4 casseroles and a quilted diaper bag, and a guilt so enormous it had converted itself entirely into practical action. She came every other weekend. She held babies and did laundry, and did not ask questions that Nora was not yet ready to answer. It was, Nora thought, the best possible version of her mother, and she was grateful for it. Rin Ashby had texted once, 3 weeks after the hearing, just 3 words, "How is he?" Nora had looked at the message for a long time. She had thought about what was right, what was appropriate, what she owed and what she didn't, what it meant to hold generosity alongside the ongoing cost of what had happened. She had sent back a photograph. Owen, sitting with assistants, grinning, with his whole face, a piece of soft banana in each fist, looking as though he had made a significant discovery about the nature of food and was extremely pleased with humanity's arrangements on the subject. Wren sent back, "Thank you." 2 words, no request for anything more. Nora looked at the response for a while. Then she went back to what she was doing. The question of what came after that, what was appropriate, what was possible, what the right shape of it was, remained open. She was not closing the door. She was also not ready to walk through it. Both of those things could be true at the same time. She had learned, in the last several months, that a great many things that seemed mutually exclusive could exist simultaneously if you were willing to hold the complexity. On a Saturday morning in early February, Nora was in the backyard. It was cold, the specific cold of early February in the Midwest, the kind that tastes like metal at the back of your throat and sits heavy in the lungs. And all 3 babies were inside with her mother, who had arrived the previous Friday and had immediately taken command of the kitchen in a way that Nora found more comforting than she had expected. Nora was standing at the far end of the garden, holding a coffee cup, wearing a winter coat over her pajamas, because she had needed air before she needed presentability. She was looking at the raised beds along the south fence. She had planted bulbs there in October, before the Coma, before everything. She had stopped at the hardware store on a Tuesday afternoon, 8 months pregnant, and bought a brown paper bag of tulip bulbs on complete impulse. She had planted them in a loose row without much deliberateness, just pressing them into the cool October earth because it was the kind of thing you did in autumn when you needed to believe that spring was coming. She had not thought about them since. She had spent October in a hospital, November fighting, December on the other side of the fight, learning what the days looked like without an emergency to organize them around. The bulbs had not been told about any of that. They had done what bulbs do, which is to say they had done nothing visible and everything essential. They had sat in the dark and the cold and converted the silence and the waiting into readiness. And now, in the first week of February, pushing up through the dead leaves and the pale light, were the first green tips, small, blunt, absolute, completely indifferent to everything that had happened in the house behind them. Spring was coming, not because the winter had been easy or because the circumstances had been favorable, not because anyone had earned it or deserved it in some ledger-keeping sense, just because that was the nature of things. The cold did its work, and the darkness did its work, and then the growing pushed back, and the green came regardless. She stood in the garden and looked at the green tips and felt something that had no single name. Not happiness exactly. Happiness was too simple a word for the complicated thing she had become in the last several months. Not relief, not triumph, which had always felt to her like a word that required an audience, something more durable than any of those. She thought about the woman who had planted these bulbs, 32 years old, 8 months pregnant, stopping on a Tuesday for no particular reason except that it was October, and she was the kind of person who wanted something to look forward to. She was still that woman, and she was also someone else now, someone who had woken up from 49 days of nothing and looked at a white ceiling and felt, before anything else, the precise location of her children in the world. Someone who had counted 3 seconds of silence and decided they meant something. Someone who had built a case from a hospital bed while performing grief she did not feel for a death that had never happened. Someone who had found her son. I was right to trust myself, she thought. every single time, I was right. Inside the house, Owen's voice came through the back window, not a cry. His announcement. The specific vocalization that meant I have determined it is time for something to happen, and I am alerting the relevant parties. Miles made a sound that suggested he was in agreement with whatever Owen had decided. Ivy, based on the quality of the silence following, was reserving judgment. Nora smiled. Her coffee had gone cold. She didn't mind. Some things were worth being outside for long enough to let the coffee go cold. She was not going to be all right in the easy, immediate way. The way stories sometimes implied you could be, on the other side of something enormous, as though resolution worked like a switch. She was going to be all right in the slower, harder, more honest way. She was going to have mornings when the weight of it returned unexpectedly, when she sat in the rocking chair in the dark and felt the specific cost of every day she had not been present for. She was going to call Dr. Crane every Wednesday and sit in the 2 minutes of silence and let it work on her. She was going to stand in her backyard in February in her pajamas and watch her tulips push up through the frozen earth with the complete determination of things that have been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. And she was going to go inside to her children. She looked at the green tips one more time. The dark does its work, she thought, and then the growing pushes back. And then spring comes regardless. She walked across the dead grass through the cold February air that tasted like metal and possibility, and she opened the back door and went inside. Owen announced himself again, louder now. "I hear you," she called. "I'm coming." She was. Editorial disclaimer. The content in this video was carefully researched, constructed, and manually edited by our team to bring you a story with genuine meaning and value. All characters, names, and events are entirely fictional and created for the purpose of entertainment, reflection, and emotional connection. Any resemblance to real persons or real events is purely coincidental. We believe that storytelling, when done with care and intention, has the power to help people feel seen, validated, and less alone. That is always our goal.